You walk into the kitchen, open the wooden cabinet beneath the sink, and you are greeted by a crowded, rattling army of plastic bottles. There is a bright yellow spray for the grease on the stovetop. There is a heavy blue jug with a child-proof cap designed to eat through the hair in a sluggish drain, smelling faintly of rotten eggs. Beside it sits a tub of abrasive paste for the porcelain sink, and perhaps a specialized chemical tube meant to clean the scorched bottom of an iron. Each one of these bottles costs $5, $7, maybe $10. When you use them, you have to twist the nozzle, pull on yellow rubber gloves so your skin doesn't peel, and step back as a sharp artificial scent. Something they call mountain spring, but smells entirely of ammonia, stings the back of your throat. We have been trained, through years of clever talking and bright labels, to believe that every single minor trouble in a household requires its own specific, expensive chemical compound. We buy 10 different bottles for 10 different jobs, filling our cupboards with warnings and poisons. Stop and think about that. Why do we pay out our hard-earned silver every single year for these heavy fluids? How did we get to a place where we believe our homes cannot be clean unless they smell like a laboratory? Now, look a bit higher up, in the quiet dark of the pantry shelf. Sitting there is a plain, rectangular cardboard box of common salt. It costs just a few pennies. So cheap we don't even think to count it in the grocery bill. Most folks look at it and see nothing but the white grit they shake over their supper to make the potatoes taste right. But on this Lancaster County place where I live, we set great store by the few plain, cheap things that can do many different turnings. My name is Elias. I am not a man with a row of letters after my name or a scientific degree from a university. I am a practitioner. I am someone who lives on the land and uses the old ways because they have been tested by the long, hard rub of generations and found true. I saw these things done with my own eyes. My mother did not keep salt just for the bread dough or the cabbage pot. She kept a great, heavy earthenware crock of it right by the kitchen hearth. A dull gray piece of stoneware, cool to the touch, with a smooth blue stripe painted across the belly. She reached her bare hand into that salt crock near as often as she reached for the water bucket, using it to mend a dozen different troubles before the sun went down. To us today, salt is an afterthought. It is cheap as dirt, and we waste it by the handful on icy sidewalks. But understand this, and understand it well. For the greater part of human history, salt was a matter of sheer survival. It was so precious that Roman soldiers were paid their wages in it, which is where our old word salary comes from. It means your salt money. My grandmother used to sit by the stove and tell me stories she had heard from her own mother about how salt was hauled into these valleys by the heavy wooden barrel, brought over the mountains by horse team, and guarded under lock and key. In those days, long before the first electric icebox was ever built, salt was the only thing standing between a family and winter hunger. It was salt that kept the pork from rotting in the cellar. It was salt that put up the autumn hams and the dried fish so they would last until the spring thaws brought the fresh greens. A family's salt supply was near as sacred as its flour. Because it was so dear, the old people couldn't afford to waste a single grain, and they studied its nature with a deep, patient attention. They didn't have microscopes, but they knew exactly what it did. Today, modern researchers look at those same white grains and tell us the very same thing in more complicated words. They tell us that sodium chloride forms a tight, cubical crystal structure. Each tiny grain is a miniature square stone with sharp, clean edges. It acts as a perfect, mild abrasive, rough enough to scrape away grease and grime. But because the mineral itself is relatively soft, it will not scratch or gouge the hard iron or porcelain beneath the mess. They tell us it is a natural desiccant, meaning it has a powerful, hungry attraction to water, pulling moisture straight out of organic material. The old people didn't know the word desiccant, but they knew that if you put salt on a wet mess, the moisture disappeared. They used what worked, and they handed that knowing down through the line now. I must give you a plain, honest word here. the way I always do. I have no interest in grand talk or clever schemes. Salt is an old friend, but it is not a worker of miracles. It has its strict, unyielding limits, and a body who uses it must use it with a clear, sober mind. If your kitchen drain is completely choked, solid with a thick plug of tree roots from the yard, pouring salt down, it will do nothing but waste your seasoning. You will need to call a man with a heavy steel snake to clear the iron pipe. If you have a deep, raging fever and a severe infection in your chest, gargling salt water will not cure you. That is a matter for a proper doctor and modern medicine. And you should not fool around with home remedies when a sickness is grave. Salt is a helper for the daily upkeep of a humble house, for lifting the common stains and taming the small accidents of a kitchen. It works where it works, and where it doesn't, we must have the wisdom to step back and use the proper tool. But within those honest boundaries, that cheap cardboard box can replace half the expensive poisons sitting under your sink right now. It cleans the caked grease, it freshens the sour cloth, it tames the worst spills, and it can even save your roof from burning down. Today, I want to show you 10 of the absolute best old uses for plain salt. Uses that were common knowledge 100 years ago, but have been crowded out by the noise of modern advertising. Let us begin with a trouble that anyone who has ever cared for clothing knows all too well. You are standing at the board, smoothing out a clean linen shirt or a dress. The iron is hot. Suddenly, you feel a heavy, sickening drag. The smooth metal plate catches on the cloth, and a sharp, acrid smell of burnt starch rises up into the room. You lift the iron, turn it over, and your heart sinks. There is a dark, sticky, gummy crust of scorched black residue baked solid onto the gleaming face of the plate. If you take a steel knife to scrape it, you will scratch the metal and ruin the iron forever. If you use a modern chemical paste, the fumes will drive you right out of the kitchen. But my mother never used chemicals, and she never ruined a tool. She would walk to the hearth, reach into that gray stoneware crock, and lift that burnt mess clean off the plate, using nothing but the heat of the iron and a handful of those white crystals. Let me show you exactly how she did it, and how those tiny sharp stones do the work without leaving a single scratch. To clean that fouled iron, the first thing you must do is clear your workspace and steady your hand. Set your iron to its highest heat, and while the metal begins to expand, you will hear it give those quiet, sporadic ticks as it grows hot. You must prepare your scouring bed. Take a plain sheet of brown wrapping paper or a few layers of unglazed newspaper. Do not use the bright, glossy pages from a modern magazine. The heat of the iron will melt those chemical inks and double your trouble. Lay the paper flat on your heavy wooden table. Now, reach into your salt crock and take a large handful. Sprinkle it over the paper until you have a thick, white snowdrift, about 1/4 of an inch deep and wide enough to cover the path of the iron. Once the iron is hot enough that a drop of water flicked onto its face dances and hisses away, take it by the handle. Press the sole of the iron firmly down into that bed of white crystals and begin to move it back and forth, slow and steady. Listen closely as you do this. You will hear a distinct, sharp crunching sound beneath the metal plate. That is the sound of thousands of tiny, square stones scraping against the scorched starch. Do not push down with your entire weight. Let the natural heaviness of the iron and the sharpness of the crystals do the labor. Within a minute or two, that loud scratching will soften into a smooth slide. Lift the iron and look at the paper. You will see that the pure white salt has gathered a mess of grayish-black, gummy clumps that have rolled right off the metal. The face of your iron will be left silver, clean, and smooth as a frozen pond, without a single scratch on its surface. Wipe it with a dry, coarse cloth while it is still warm, and it is ready to glide across your finest linen. The common mistake here is rushing the process or using too thin a layer of salt, which allows the iron to scorch the paper beneath. Give it a thick bed, move it with a steady hand, and let the old stone do its work. Now, let us walk over to the kitchen floor where that dropped egg lies. It is a miserable little sight. a clear, slimy puddle of albumin, with that bright yellow eye of a yolk staring up at you from the floorboards. If you reach for a wet rag or a handful of paper towels now, you will only chase that slippery fluid around the floor, smearing it into a wide, greasy circle that takes 10 minutes to clean. Instead, take your box of salt and shake it generously until the entire egg is buried beneath white mound. Now, you must practice a bit of old-fashioned patience. Stop and think before you reach for your broom. Walk away and give it a full 15 minutes by the clock. During those minutes, a quiet piece of nature is unfolding on your floor. The dry salt is hungry for water, and it begins to draw the moisture straight out of the egg white. If you watch closely, you will see the white edges turn cloudy and firm. The runny slime coagulates, tightening into a soft, solid mass, much like an unbaked bread dough. When the 15 minutes have run out, you do not need a cloth at all. Take your wooden broom and a dry dustpan, and with one clean, effortless sweep, the entire egg slides right into the pan as a single, firm cake. There is no smear, no yellow stain left in the grain of the wood, and no sticky residue. The great mistake beginners make here is losing patience after 5 minutes. If you try to sweep it while the center is still fluid, you will break the salt crust and create a gritty yellow paste that is twice as hard to clean as the original egg. Let it sit until it is truly firm. Next is the matter of the grease fire, and this is where you must steady your mind and train out your instincts. Imagine a heavy cast iron skillet on your stove. The lard grows too hot, a dark, acrid blue ribbon of smoke rises, and suddenly, with a quiet whoosh, the pan bursts into angry yellow flames that leap toward the shelf above. Your heart thumps, and your natural instinct is to run to the pump for a bucket of water. Understand this, and remember it cold. Water on a grease fire is a deadly error. The water is heavier than the oil, so it sinks instantly to the bottom of the hot pan. But because the burning grease is far hotter than the boiling point of water, that fluid flashes into steam in a microsecond, expanding violently and blasting upward. It throws millions of microscopic, flaming droplets of oil into the air, creating a great roaring ball of fire that will consume your kitchen in a single breath. Instead, you stand your ground. You grab that plain box of salt from the shelf, pull open the metal tab, and dump the white crystals directly onto the flames. Do not sprinkle it like seasoning. Pour it heavily, the whole box if necessary, until the yellow fire is completely buried under a white blanket. The salt cannot burn. It sits like a heavy sheet of lead over the oil, shutting out the air completely. The flames will give a final muffled hiss and die away into black smoke. The common mistake here is fear, throwing a timid pinch of salt from across the room. A pinch will do nothing but scatter. You must get close enough to deliver a heavy, unyielding blanket of the white grit to smother the fire completely. When the cooking is done and the stove is cold, you may find yourself looking at a skillet with black, scorched food carbonized onto the bottom. If it is an old cast iron pan, you must never use modern soap or steel wool, for those will strip away that dark, glossy layer of baked oil we call the seasoning, the very thing that keeps your eggs from sticking tomorrow. Instead, while the pan is still slightly warm to the touch, throw in a big handful of coarse rock salt. Take a dry, stiff bristle brush or a tightly wadded piece of coarse sacking cloth and scrub the dry iron. You will hear a loud, raspy scratching. The white salt will slowly turn a dull, charcoal gray as it grinds the burnt crust into fine dust, leaving the black iron beneath completely untouched and its precious seasoning whole. Wipe the gray dust out with a clean rag, rub a single drop of fresh lard over the smooth metal, and hang it back on its iron hook. For an ordinary tin or enamel pan with a stubborn, burnt mess, you can make a wet paste. Mix 2 tablespoons of salt with just a few drops of water until it has the consistency of thick, gritty cream. Spread it over the black crust and let it sit for 10 minutes to loosen the grip of the burnt sugars before you wipe it clean with an ordinary cloth. From that cleaning, your sponge or washcloth may be left greasy and sour smelling. Do not throw it into the waste heap. Take a small stoneware bowl and fill it with 2 cups of cool water from the pump. Stir in a 1/4 cup of salt until the water turns clear again and the crystals disappear. Submerge your greasy sponge into this brine and leave it overnight. By morning, you will see the water has turned a murky, yellowish color. The salt has drawn the grease and the stagnant smell right out of the fibers. Rinse it in fresh water and it will come out clean and firm. If it is the porcelain tub or the sink that has those ugly, rusty yellow streaks where the well water drips. You can make an effective scrub without those harsh commercial powders that dull the glaze over time. Take a fresh lemon from the pantry and cut it clean through the middle. Shake a heavy layer of salt directly onto the wet, yellow face of the cut fruit. Use the lemon itself as your scrubbing brush, pressing the salted face firmly against the rust stain. The sour acid of the lemon juice dissolves the hard mineral crust, while the salt provides the teeth to scour it away. As you work, the room will fill with the clean, bright scent of citrus, completely different from the choking ammonia fumes of store-bought bleaches. But heed my earlier warning, keep this acid paste away from natural marble or soft stone, or it will etch the polish and leave a dull white mark that cannot be rubbed out for a sluggish kitchen drain where the gray water lingers and gurgles. Mix a 1/4 cup of baking soda and a 1/4 cup of salt together in a dry cup. Pour this dry white powder straight down the dark iron drain opening. Immediately after, pour down a 1/2 cup of plain white vinegar. You will hear a deep, muffled, fizzing and hissing inside the pipe as a thick, white foam bubbles up through the grate. The salt adds weight and a scouring grit to that foaming action, helping it scrape the greasy soap scum from the iron walls of the pipe. Let it work for 15 minutes while you boil a heavy copper kettle on the stove. When the water is screaming, pour it straight down the drain to flush the loosened gunk away. In the kitchen, if you are peeling a great mountain of apples for a winter pie, keep a large bowl of cold water by your elbow with a single teaspoon of salt stirred into it. As you slice each apple, drop the white pieces into the brine. They will stay pale as milk for hours because the light salt coat blocks the air from turning the iron in the fruit brown. A quick rinse in fresh water before they go into the crust removes any trace of salt, leaving your pie beautiful. And if you ever doubt an egg from the coop, fill a deep glass with water and stir in 3 tablespoons of salt until it dissolves. Drop the egg in. A fresh good egg is heavy and will sink like a stone, lying flat on its side at the bottom. An old egg, which has lost its internal moisture through the tiny pores of its shell and filled with air, will bob straight to the top like a little white cork. If it floats, discard it before it spoils your batter. Finally, for that raw, scratchy throat, when the winter winds blow down the chimney, take 1 cup of warm water, comfortably warm, like a summer bath, and stir in a single teaspoon of salt until the liquid is slightly cloudy. Take a large mouthful, tilt your head back, and gargle deep in the throat for 30 seconds. You will taste the sharp, clean brine. Spit it out and retreat until the cup is empty. The salt draws the excess fluid out of the swollen, angry tissues of your throat, easing the tightness and bringing a quiet comfort that no expensive chemical lozenge can ever match. Now, the old people who settled these valleys didn't need a textbook to tell them why a handful of salt would clean an iron or settle a dropped egg. They simply watched the world with open eyes, saw what worked, and remembered it. But in our time, folks like to know the inner workings of a thing, the hidden clockwork underneath. And understanding the why of it is a useful thing, because when you know exactly how a tool cuts, you are far less likely to dull its edge or misuse it. Stop and think about what happens when you look closely at a single grain of plain salt. If you were to hold it under a strong glass, you would see it isn't an irregular, broken clump like a bit of crushed river stone. It is a perfect, clean little cube. It has sharp corners, straight edges, and flat faces. When you throw a handful of these crystals onto a pan or an iron, you are essentially deploying an army of thousands of tiny microscopic sanding blocks. Now, why doesn't it ruin your fine tools? The men who study minerals have a scale for hardness where a diamond sits at the very top and soft talc sits at the bottom. Iron, steel, and the glass glaze baked onto a porcelain sink sit quite high on that scale. Salt sits much lower, right around the middle. This means that a grain of salt is hard enough to scrape away the soft, gummy residue of burnt sugar, congealed grease, or hard water crust, but it is physically too soft to cut into the iron or the porcelain itself. It is a bit like using a wooden scraper to remove old paint from a glass window pane. The wood will lift the paint, but it cannot scratch the glass, because the glass is too hard to care. That is the mechanical secret of the salt scrub. It is a self-limiting abrasive. It grinds away the filth, and then it dissolves or washes away when its job is done, leaving the surface beneath whole and unmarred. The second principle is what my mother called the thirst of salt, though a school teacher today would call it osmosis. Understand this. Salt has an insatiable, powerful appetite for moisture. It cannot rest until it has balanced itself with the water around it. Think of it like a dry sponge that is incredibly small, but multiplied by millions. When you pour salt onto a dropped, runny egg, those hungry crystals immediately begin to draw the water out of the liquid albumin. In nature, water will always move through a thin skin or a fluid toward the place where the salt is thickest, trying to dilute it. By drawing that water out, the salt causes the proteins in the egg to crowd together, tangle up, and stiffen. It turns a slippery, unmanageable fluid into a cohesive, doughy mat. The same thing happens when you gargle that warm brine for a sore throat. The tissues in your throat are swollen because they are filled with excess fluid from the inflammation. When the salty water washes over them, it draws that trapped fluid out through the tiny membranes of your skin, lowering the swelling and relieving the dull ache, just like drying out a damp cellar. It doesn't kill the root of the sickness, but it changes the environment, pulling away the fluid that makes the throat feel heavy and raw. When it comes to a grease fire, the science is a matter of weight and heat. A fire is a simple creature. It needs three things to live: fuel, heat, and air. If you take away any one of those three, the fire dies. A grease fire is particularly dangerous because the liquid fuel is boiling hot and can easily splash. When you dump a heavy blanket of dry salt onto that burning pan, you are using a material that has an incredibly high melting point. Salt will not melt until it reaches nearly 1400 degrees, far hotter than any kitchen stove can ever manage. Because it cannot burn and cannot melt under those conditions, it simply sits there like a heavy stone wall, completely blocking the oxygen in the room from reaching the hot oil beneath. The fire is suffocated in an instant. But as I have said before, we must look at the dark side of the coin as well. Every tool has its limitations, and salt has some very sharp ones that you must respect, or you will do more harm than good. First, understand that while salt is a friend to cast iron during the cleaning, it is a mortal enemy to iron and steel if it is left behind with moisture. Salt acts as an accelerator for rust. It helps the oxygen in the air eat into iron at a terrifying speed. That is why, when you use the dry salt method to clean your iron skillet, you must be absolutely certain to wipe every single grain out of the pan when you are finished. If you leave a few grains of salt in the corner of the skillet and the air in your kitchen is damp, you will wake up the next morning to find red spots of rust pitting the smooth black surface. Clean with it, yes, but then remove it completely and seal the iron with a fresh layer of grease or oil. Second, salt should never be used on aluminum pans. Aluminum is a soft, reactive metal. If you leave salt or a salty brine sitting in an aluminum vessel, the chemicals will react with the metal, causing what is called pitting. It will eat tiny, microscopic holes into the metal, darkening it and ruining the smooth finish. Third, you must be careful with your stone. I mentioned using salt and lemon for the porcelain tub, but if you have a modern countertop made of granite, marble, or limestone, keep that mixture far away from it. Marble and limestone are made of calcium carbonate. which is easily dissolved by any acid. The lemon juice or vinegar will etch the stone, leaving dull, white, cloudy spots that look like water stains, but are actually areas where the stone has been eaten away. And finally, remember the limits of scale. The foaming drain cleaner of salt, soda, and vinegar is excellent for the routine grease and hair that builds up from daily washing, but it works by loosening the outer layers of the gunk. If a toy or a thick bundle of heavy rags has gotten wedged deep down in the trap of the pipe, no amount of foaming bubbles will dissolve it. You must use a mechanical auger or take the pipes apart. The same goes for the fire. A box of salt is for a pan you can reach with your arm. If the grease has splattered onto the wall and the curtains are catching, the salt is useless. You must leave the house and let the men with the heavy hoses handle it. Do not expect a single box to do the work of a whole town. Use it where its nature fits the task, as a gentle sander, a dry sponge, or a heavy blanket, and it will serve you faithfully for pennies, just as it served the old people who walked these floors before us. When you stand in your kitchen with that cheap cardboard box in your hand, you are holding onto a thin, invisible thread that stretches straight back through the centuries. This knowing I am sharing with you today did not begin with my mother's stoneware crock, nor did it start with her grandmother's barrel, brought over the Blue Hills by horse team. It belongs to a long, unbroken line of ordinary people who had to be smart because they couldn't afford to be wasteful. It is the wisdom of the frontier, the Fult farmstead, and the quiet kitchens where a penny saved was a piece of independence earned. Understand this before the world became crowded with heavy factories and chemical plants. Books were written to help common folk manage their homes with dignity, safety, and strict thrift. If you look into the historical archives, you will find a landmark little book published in the year 1829, written by a woman named Lydia Maria Child. It was called The American Frugal Housewife, and it became the practical handbook for thousands of families settling the towns and wilderness of this country. Mrs. Child didn't have a shelf full of plastic spray bottles under her washstand. She explicitly set down the rule that the true economy of housekeeping is simply the art of gathering up all the fragments so that nothing be lost. And right there in those vintage pages, printed on rough rag paper by a hand-set press, she recorded the very same tricks we use today. She wrote about rubbing dried table salt onto stubborn stains, using it alongside the acid of lemon juice to lift the heavy dark discoloration from fine cloth, and keeping a heavy supply of it near the hearth to damp down an unexpected grease flare before it could catch the wooden beams of the kitchen ceiling. To those people, salt wasn't a specialty item. It was a basic shield against the small disasters of daily life. Google Books you show too, and it wasn't just old grandmothers and country folk who kept this knowledge alive. When the world grew more modern, the official institutions of this country looked at these traditional methods and confirmed them to be absolutely sound. If you dig into the historical records of the United States Department of Agriculture from the early decades of the 20th century, specifically the old farmers' bulletins that were printed on plain newsprint and sent out to rural homes, you will find these exact methods codified by government researchers. In Farm's Bulletin No. 1180, which was printed to help farm families make their daily house cleaning easier and cheaper, the experts of the day didn't recommend fancy brand-name chemical powders. They instructed the reader quite plainly to use a dry scrub of common salt and a stiff brush to clear the baked grease from cast ironware, noting that it preserved the surface better than any industrial solvent. Furthermore, the old agricultural extension circulars published by the Pennsylvania State College in the 1920s regularly carried instructions for farm wives on how to manage their drains and hearths safely. They wrote out the instructions for the salt, soda, and vinegar foam to keep the kitchen lines clear of soap scum, explicitly warning families against the dangers of buying costly, industrial caustic solutions that could corrode the old lead pipes and burn the skin. These agencies didn't publish these things to be quaint or nostalgic. They published them because they were the most effective, safest, and most economical solutions available to a self-sufficient home. The science simply caught up to what the old people had already discovered by the steady work of their hands. Stop and think about how we lost touch with this. It didn't happen because salt stopped working. It happened because the world changed its way of talking to us. After the Great Wars, heavy industry discovered that there was an immense fortune to be made in specialization. If you can convince a householder that they need a specific chemical for the iron, another for the porcelain, a third for the sponge, and a fourth for the drain, you have created 4 distinct needs where there was originally none. There is no money to be made in telling a man to look inside the cheap box he already owns. And so, the old knowing was gently pushed into the corner, crowded out by bright television advertisements and shelves packed with colorful plastic bottles. We didn't choose to forget. We were simply trained to look away from the simple things. But the beautiful truth of the matter is that the salt has not changed. Those tiny, sharp cubical stones are just as hard and effective today as they were when Lydia Maria Child wrote her manual 2 centuries ago. The thirst of those white crystals is just as powerful now as it was when my mother reached into her cool, blue-striped crock by the kitchen fire. The knowledge is not dead. It is merely waiting for you to pick it up and put it to work. I want to invite you to take a step back from the modern noise this very evening. Do not go out to the store and spend $20 on specialized chemical cleaners. Walk into your own kitchen, open the cupboard, and pull out that humble, cheap box of plain table salt. Find one small trouble in your house. Perhaps a pan with a stubborn burnt crust from breakfast, a slow drain in the washroom, or an old yellow water stain in the sink. Take a handful of those white crystals and apply the method yourself. Listen to the crisp sound of the grains scrubbing the iron. Feel the consistency of the egg fluid turning firm under the dry white mound. Watch the yellow rust dissolve under the sour wet face of the salted lemon. When you see it work with your own eyes, something shifts inside you. You realize that you do not need to be dependent on a dozen different manufactured products just to keep a clean and orderly home. You realize that self-sufficiency is not a grand romantic philosophy that requires you to move out into the deep woods and build a log cabin. It is a quiet, practical choice that you make right at your own kitchen counter, using the simple, honest things that are already within your reach. It is about taking back the mastery of your own place, one penny and one task at a time. The people who built this country with their bare hands knew that a home could be run with nothing but a few plain tools, a box of salt, and a bit of clear, patient knowing. That wisdom is your inheritance. Keep that box handy by your stove. Set store by the simple things, and let the old ways keep you steady. Until next time, take care of your place.